All right, we are live from the studios of the American Experiment podcast. Today, doing a webinar, a Feeding Our Future webinar. Welcome to the Feeding Our Future webinar. Big Fish goes on trial. We'll get into quickly who the big fish is. I think you know Aimee Bock, the big fish of Feeding Our Future. My name is Bill Walsh. I am the director of marketing and communications for Center of the American Experiment. I am joined by my colleague Bill Glahn, who is on the webinar from a secret location in the United States somewhere. Bill has been the guy who has been doggedly writing about and exposing the Feeding Our Future scandal from the beginning. Now going on 3 years. Are we in 3 years on this scandal now,
Three
Bill?
years, three
Yeah.
years.
So this is, I think, the fifth or fourth webinar we've done on the topic. We thought first one of the year, 2025. We thought what a good way to start the year, but to get an update. And so we'll look ahead to trials that are upcoming in February. We'll look back quickly. We'll talk about some reforms at the legislature on fraud generally, and then just a program note. Because Bill and I are on the webinar and we have a bunch of people signed up and tuning in as we speak, we thought it'd be fun and interesting to just do a little bit on the legislature because on Tuesday, January 14th, the legislature is going to convene, and we have really no idea what the heck's going to happen. So we'll spend a little bit of time at the end, maybe 10 minutes at the end of this webinar, talking about the legislature and legislative update. So as we go, I'm just going to get Bill started talking and then stay out of the way because he's got a lot of information to share on Feeding Our Future and update. If you have questions, there is a question Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, I hope. And just click on that and start dumping the questions in. I can see them. Producer Isaac can see them, so we can start to hopefully maybe people have the same question. We'll see how many we get, and we'll see how many we can handle towards the end of the podcast or the webinar before we go into a legislative update. So with that housekeeping being said, let's get into it. The big fish is Aimee Bock. She was the executive director. I think that was her title at Feeding Our Future, which was a food, the grantee basically in the hierarchy of things. They applied for money from MDE to send to food distribution sites. They were kind of the middleman facilitator for this. So Feeding Our Future, that got the name of the scandal, kind of like, like a generic name, but we call it Feeding Our Future. But we're going to talk today about actually Feeding Our Future, the company, and Aimee Bock, its executive director, who is soon to go on trial. Is that right, Bill?
That's right. And you mentioned the 3 years. It has been almost exactly 3 years since the FBI raided the corporate offices of Feeding Our Future up in St. Anthony, as well as dozens and dozens of other locations in the Twin Cities. On one of the coldest days of the year, January 2022, the FBI assembled 200 officers, FBI agents, IRS agents, whoever they could commandeer to execute these search warrants. And the first one was on Aimee Bock's office in St. Anthony and her home down in Rosemount. And since then, in the 3 years since then, 70 defendants have been indicted in the case. And we number them. We have an official numbering system for them, 1 through 70. And Aimee Bock is defendant number 1 in the case. She was the founder and CEO of this nonprofit corporation called Feeding Our Future. And it wasn't a charity. It didn't get donations from the general public. It existed to facilitate this food program that run by the state government, where they got money from the state government to distribute to other nonprofits and for-profits that were supposed to be feeding children, and it turns out they weren't. And estimates of the fraud range anywhere from $250 million above $500 million, where money was taken out of these food programs and just stolen and wasn't used to feed children. And so what's happening in 2025 is, after 3 years, we're finally getting to the trials phase of it. We're going to have courtroom trials in the federal courthouse in downtown Minneapolis beginning February 3rd and monthly all the way through December. And so finally, some of these folks are facing justice. We had a trial last year I'll talk a little bit about. But we're going to have a trial starting February 3rd, and Aimee Bock is the lead defendant in that trial. And she's going to face trial with 3 other co-defendants, 2 of whom owned a restaurant called Safari Restaurant, and that got a lot of attention early on. It was one of the epicenters of the fraud. The 2 co-owners of that restaurant will be on trial along with Aimee Bock, and the 4th defendant is a guy named Abdi Salah, who was a senior policy aide to Mayor Jacob Fry. That was his day job. He was a city government employee working directly for the mayor. And he was on the side, allegedly stealing money through this food program, and he's going to be on trial as well.
I guess we're not that big of a town that eventually someone's going to get brought up in these names, the list of names that has political connections. Shouldn't shock us, shouldn't surprise us, but kind of concerning too at the same time. A guy that high up in the mayor's office, I assume he's been fired or he's left.
Well,
He's no
he
longer an
again,
employee.
that was interesting when this all came out, and I think his name first came up in February of 2022. He left the employ of the city, and because of personnel and privacy laws, we never got an answer to did he quit? Was he fired?
He
What was
wanted
the
to spend more time with
circumstances?
his family,
Right. But there was
what I heard.
another individual, another city employee who ran the public housing authority of the city of Minneapolis. He was a two-time appointee by the mayor to chair the public housing authority of Minneapolis. He's been indicted in the case. He hasn't come to trial yet, but he's another one of the defendants.
So good questions already coming in. I think maybe we'll just do this on the fly a little bit too, because this question I was going to ask you anyway. These are, just to be clear, federal charges in federal court. And this was the work of the U.S. attorney. Now we're going to get a switch over in U.S. attorneys now because we have a new president. Do you think that's going to impact everything? Just talk about the court setup.
Yeah, I don't think the changeover in administrations is going to impact the Feeding Our Future. These trials have all been scheduled. They're in front of a judge who has a life tenure, so nothing's going to happen with this. But yes, all these charges were brought by U.S. Attorney Andy Lugar, who was appointed to this position by Joe Biden. But the you may recall early on in this case, it actually goes back before 2022 when the Department of Education at the state level is investigating this. So this actually predates Andy Lugar's tenure, his second go around and he's going to move into the sunset. Trump's going to appoint a new U.S. attorney. Interestingly enough, one of the people who has applied for the job of U.S. attorney is the lead prosecutor in the case, a guy named Joe Thompson. So I don't anticipate any change in prosecutions of this case as a result of Andy Lugar's leaving his position.
Okay. And so Aimee Bock, a big name, obviously, because she got, I think, the most media attention and Feeding Our Future did. So she's on trial with three other folks, defendants, which you talked about. What's she going to say? What's her defense? You have an idea what her defense is?
Yeah, her defense is going to be what it's always been, that she's innocent, that she committed no crimes, that she has put herself since the early days of the scandal. She's put forward that she's as shocked as anyone that there was fraud going on in her organization, that if they put one over on the state, they put one over on her as well, that she did her level best to make sure that everything was being done on the up and up. And if they fooled the government, they fooled her as well. So she claims to be an unwitting dupe of the whole scandal. But again, there's going to be in the next week or so, they're going to publish the list of exhibits. And again, the U.S. attorney through the FBI has access to all of her cell phone records, all of her emails, all of her banking records. Hard to believe they would bring this to trial if they looked into this and go, nah, she was an innocent dupe. Because there have been lots of people whose names have come up who haven't been indicted, but she was the defendant number one in the case.
Just so you know, you said defendant number one. That's the court naming those defendants, or us, American
Well,
Experiment.
it's actually Sahan Journal keeps a running log
Okay,
of
good.
everybody.
All
Sahan
right.
Journal is another alternative media publication. They keep the running log of everyone who's been indicted. They keep a running log of everyone who's been convicted or pled guilty in the case. But in this indictment, there are 14 people. 14 of the 70 are in this indictment. And in this indictment, she's defendant number one.
Okay.
They do
I,
number them in each indictment. So
I
in
should have
fact,
started with this. Go ahead.
this they learned their lesson. We'll get into the trial that happened last year. They learned their lesson. That is, the U.S. attorney learned his lesson. He put 7 people on trial at once in this fraud, and 2 of them got lost in the shuffle and ended up being acquitted. So
Hmm.
he's not making that mistake again. So he's narrowed it down to no more than, say, 4 or 5 at a time are going to go on trial at any given interval. And in fact, of the 14, these are defendants numbers 1, 3, 4, and 6. So
Okay.
they're trying to take them in order. So she's defendant number one. Defendant number two happens to be an international fugitive from justice. He fled early on, and we don't know where he is, and not coming back. And then defendant number five pled guilty. So there's no reason to put that defendant on trial. So they're just working down the list. And so she's defendant number one of this pod, if you will, of this group. But again, we have fugitives who have left the country, never going to be on trial, people who have pled guilty. We've had 5 people who were convicted in that first trial last year, and there have been some 23 of the 70 who have pled guilty. So we have 28 people who have been convicted in this scandal so far. And this next batch of 4 is going on trial beginning February 3rd.
So I should have started with this maybe. What is Aimee Bock and her co-defendants being charged with? What did they do wrong according to the government?
Well, interesting. You mentioned in the question was, these are federal trial. This is a federal trial. So in order for there to be federal jurisdiction, there has to be some sort of interstate commerce angle to it. So the core charges against these defendants is wire fraud. That is, they sent emails or text messages that went through the interstate communications system, and they're being charged with wire fraud. They're not being charged with theft. It's perhaps a distinction without a difference. If they were in state court, they'd all be charged with theft. But they're being charged with wire fraud because this is federal court. They're being charged with conspiracy. It's a conspiracy case that they got together to perpetrate this fraud. There are some bribery charges, and there are money laundering charges. So, each of the defendants is being charged on multiple counts, multiple felony counts. Interesting, from memory, the last trial involves 7 defendants, and the jury had to reach something like 43 separate verdicts on each of the counts in the indictment. So, that trial lasted for months. They're hoping to get this one done in 4 weeks.
So essentially, just to break it down, I mean, you've got a federal program administered by a state Department of Education to get kids fed during the summer because COVID is terrible and everyone's afraid nobody can go out. So we got to get meals to kids. So we have these sites set up. So the fraud is in, like you say, not so much theft of that federal money administered by the state agency, but in the kind of the back and forth between these folks and like if you do this, you can skim that off the top, or we'll get our money and then we'll pay you back from those proceeds because we didn't feed any kids and buy any meals, but we kept the money. So we'll keep half and we'll give you half. Is that kind of what we're dealing with here?
Well, it's more like the way it was supposed to work, and the way it works for most of the legitimate providers of these programs, is a daycare or like a YMCA or a church would operate a food program to feed children, and they would get reimbursed. It's a reimbursement program, anywhere between $1 and $3 per meal. $1 and $3 per meal, depending on what the meal was, breakfast, lunch, whatever. And then they would go and apply for reimbursement through a nonprofit like Feeding Our Future to the State Department of Education, who would write a check for the cost of the meals that were allegedly served by the church or the daycare or whoever. And the middleman, the nonprofit in between, they're called a sponsor. Feeding Our Future was a sponsor. They take a 10 or 15% cut. And so how Feeding Our Future got rich is taking that 10 to 15% cut of all these invoices. And the way the providers got rich was they said, in round terms, I fed 1,000 kids on January 9th. In reality, I only fed 100, but I billed for 1,000. So at its core, to greatly simplify, it's an overbilling case. And so the defense is mostly, we fed kids. We have all the proof that we fed kids. Yeah, you fed 100, but you billed for 1,000. And they're going to try to muddy the waters so for the jurors, and it didn't work in the last case, but to think, well, I got food invoices, I bought food from Cisco, or I went to Costco or Sam's Club and bought food in bulk, and I fed children. But yeah, you added a 0 to every invoice that you sent out, and you just pocketed that money. Nobody anywhere can get rich feeding children $1 a meal unless you're just not feeding the children. And they have evidence that they use the money to buy commercial real estate, luxury homes, luxury automobiles, Las Vegas junkets. You can't do that on $1 a meal.
Yeah, when you say things like that, they went and bought stuff that's sort of, I don't know, flamboyant or out there, cars and things like that. It's like, I
Somebody
feel
bought
like,
an airplane.
yeah, I feel like these are the dumb criminals, and so we caught the dumb criminals. Do you have any idea or idea? But do you have any guess at how much smart criminals we're missing? I mean, we think we can identify 250 million here, but it could be way more than that in terms of fraud that was smarter and didn't get caught.
Yeah, there is a lid to this because the program itself only paid out so much money to the daycares and the YMCA's and all the legitimate. So at the peak of the fraud, while it was going on, most of this program, most of the program's money was going to fraudsters who were
Yikes.
later indicted. So it's not like, oh, 500 million, but it was, it's a $5 billion program. No, it's like 500 million out of a $750 million program. Most of the money went to fraud, and this has been documented.
All right, so just to be a few more technical details, federal court, jury trial. So there'll be like a
Yep.
normal, like we'll pick a jury, and then what remind us the other three people? We knew Aimee Bock was executive director. The other three what were roles? Were they at food sites or were they working for her or with her?
Right. So there was a company called Sapphire Restaurant. It was located off of Lake Street in South Minneapolis. And it was a legitimate restaurant. It was around for a long time. In fact, one of these weird coincidences of the case, at her first ever victory party, getting elected to Congress, Ilhan Omar had her victory party at this restaurant, right in the middle of her district. It's an ethnic restaurant. So it was a pillar of the community. And the two co-owners of this restaurant are her co-defendants in this round of the trial. And they operated allegedly a food site at their restaurant the first year of the pandemic and took millions of dollars out of the program. And then at some point, the Department of Education says, you can't do that. That for-profit entities cannot operate distribution sites. That's against the program rules. And so this restaurant then became a food vendor to other nonprofits and kept taking in money through that mechanism. So this one restaurant that went out of business right after the FBI raids was at the center of the scandal. And then this Abdi Salah just happened to be next on the list, the aide to the mayor on the roster in the indictment, and he's also on trial.
Okay. Anything else we need to know about Aimee Bock before we maybe go backwards maybe and just talk
Yeah,
about
let's
where
talk
we're
about
at
what's
with you've
happened.
kind of mentioned some of those 28 that have already been adjudicated.
Yeah, so there've been 70 indicted so far, and every time there's a round of indictments, and there was one earlier in 2024, the U.S. attorney gets in front of the microphone and says there will be more to come. So we probably haven't seen the last indictment in this case, but of the 70 who have been indicted, 23 have pled guilty. Was a trial that started last spring, and people will remember this, lasted for several months. Of the 7 who were put on trial at that time, they were involved at a different restaurant called Empire Cuisine that was located in Shakopee. It's not in business anymore either. They were put on trial. The trial lasted for months. The jury reached its verdict. 5 were convicted, 2 were acquitted. And so we have 5 who were convicted, 23 who have pled guilty. Out of all of those, only 1 has ever been sentenced. 1 of those 28 convicted in the case has been sentenced, and that happened last fall. And they got something like 12 years in federal prison. But none of
So
the others have ever.
that's one of the questions in the chat actually. When are these guys going to prison? I mean, what's taking so long?
Well, it's just amazing. And people see this if they follow some of the proceedings against Donald Trump in federal court or any of the other. These things take years. You hear about the right to a speedy trial. That's in the Constitution. You as a defendant have a right to a speedy trial. But the government doesn't have a right to a speedy trial. If you're a defendant and don't think you're going to benefit from a speedy trial, you have almost an infinite number of things to drag these proceedings out. So the people who have been convicted, and actually there were some who had sentencing dates scheduled, and those all got postponed because lawyers for the defendants who are going to go to jail are fighting with the government over how long they're going to be sent to jail. So there was a whole other batch of them who were supposed to be sentenced last September, and that's got pushed back indefinitely. So there's almost, if you're a defense lawyer and you're being paid, by the government, because everybody has a right to an attorney, There's almost infinite tools at your disposal to keep pushing this out and pushing this out. Now, at the same time, we had that trial. People remember the attempt to bribe the juror.
Oh, yeah.
The dramatic scene where this bag woman they recruited and flew out from Seattle, Washington. She dropped a Hallmark gift bag with $120,000 and unmarked bills, the old cliche, on the stoop of the house of one of the jurors. And it didn't work. It got found out. The juror immediately called the local cops to say, hey, they dropped this bag of cash on my front step. So that's a separate case. And that will probably also go to trial in 2025. The case of the 5 who were indicted in the bribery attempt. Oddly enough, one of the 2 defendants in the fraud case who were acquitted later indicted in the bribery case, and he's in jail. So he's in jail awaiting trial on the bribery case, even though he was exonerated in the fraud case. So that's going on, and we're still waiting for the fallout of that.
Another question from the chat, a good one too. Just clawback. I mean, are we getting, are we getting the airplane back? Did we get the cars back? Did we get the real estate back? Do we get the money back? How much work has been done on clawing back some of these assets that were stolen?
There's been quite a bit of work. And in fact, I follow the court dockets. I check it every couple of days, and there are constant filings about the forfeiture part of it. So the people who have pled guilty, the people who have been convicted, they're all subject to forfeiture. On paper, they're supposed to pay it all back. But the problem is a lot of the money just got sent overseas. It was already spent. The Las Vegas junkets I mentioned, overseas travel. The money's gone. You're not getting it back. Home Depot got it. You're not clawing it back from Home Depot. But what happened, a lot of these vehicles were commandeered and sold at auction. The commercial real estate, some of that has already been sold at auction. Some of the private homes that got bought with the money stolen from the government, those were seized and sold at auction. So the government says so far they've clawed back between 50 and 60 million, out of the 250 million that they say was stolen. That's not a big number, but still 50 to 60 million has been clawed back. And they're constantly trying to seize more of it. But some of it, they spent money on jewelry and clothing, the resale value of that's not what was, or the trucks or Teslas that got purchased, you sell it used, you're not getting the list price out of it, but they're making an effort. But these are the feds. This was a state program that they stole from, and there's been zero effort on the part of state government. State government isn't suing any of these people trying to claw the money back. This is all up to the feds, and I have never understood why.
Yeah, that's the couple of questions in the chat kind of get at that too. It's like, how and when does this fall back on Tim Walz as governor? Or one question says, did MDE, as a pass-through, basically administrator of these federal funds, did they make any money on this? You say make any money? Well, they're not really a for-profit organization. I think I know the answer to the MDE question. I mean, they would have received in any kind of federal grant that a state agency receives. There is a percentage allocated for administration purposes. So they would have said, all right, we're going to take 10% of this grant.
See, this is
and
the
use
problem.
it for admin.
It's a percent deal. So if the thing is 3/4 fraud, their cut is increased by 3/4 because of the fraud.
Yeah.
So yes, the government benefited because they got more federal dollars for administering this much bigger program. The program was so big because of the fraud. So again, they have a perverse incentive that they don't care who they give the money to, whether the legitimate recipients or they're fraudsters, because they get their cut too. So yes, we haven't seen any evidence of individuals at the state government pocketing money to facilitate the fraud. That's never been presented. But state government benefits in the sense that they have a bigger budget, bigger administrative budget. But interestingly enough, on the flip side of this, and this gets back to what the government knew and when they knew it, the Department of Education knew who the fraudsters were going to be before they stole the first dollar. So a bunch of these people, including Safari Restaurants, submitted applications to participate in the program, and they submitted these applications back March, April of 2020, right when the beginning of the pandemic was occurring. the initial reaction of the Department of Education was to deny their applications. They said, you're not a legitimate operator. We're not going to let you participate in the program. We could have stopped this thing before it started. But what happened was Feeding Our Future said, oh, we're going to sue you because you're a racist and you hate minority children, you hate ethnic children, and that's who is going to be fed by these sites. And we're going to sue you if you don't approve their application. And they got scared. The Department of Education got scared, and they approved all the applications. 6 months later, the Department of Education figured out, those guys didn't actually feed any children. We're canceling their participation in the program. That was October of 2020. November of 2020, Feeding Our Future did sue. They went to state court and sued, saying they had no right to cut these programs off from these recipients, and they were fighting in court for a couple of years. So the $250 million all went out the door after the Department of Education had figured out who the fraudsters were. So we're going to get to it in a little bit, I guess, about what's going to happen going forward. How do we prevent the next Feeding Our Future, and what can be done about this?
I think it's fascinating that there's a new book coming out. Well, it's going to be a year, I think, but there's a kind of trending author, a professor in Canada. I'm going to say his name wrong, but God Saad, Saad, and the book is called Suicidal Empathy. And that's a great example right there. We should send it to him for this book. It's like, so the folks at MDE got frozen with their empathy for a minority group and even challenged on it by Feeding Our Future. They hit them where they knew it would hurt, and their empathy took over. And well, we can't do the right thing here because it might affect the minority group a certain way. So we're going to go ahead and allow this fraud to happen, which becomes the societal suicide, where we're wasting money, taking money out of the pockets of taxpayers and wasting it and wrecking our state because of empathy. And so keep your eye on that author. We're going to try, hopefully bring him in at some point in a future American Experiment event, especially when that book is done. But just a great, they get paralyzed. These bureaucrats get paralyzed in fear. And then they lose their minds. And I think we'll talk about that in a second.
You mentioned Andy Luger earlier in the program. Andy Luger, in kind of his exit interview with local media as he goes out the door, says, and I quote, Minnesota has a fraud problem. And he points out that Feeding Our Future happened in Minnesota. There was nothing like this in any other state. Now, there were other states that had fraud, but it was all small scale. It was millions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's something unique about government in Minnesota or the culture in Minnesota where this happened here and not any of the other 49 states. So he made that statement. And then we have somebody who's called the legislative auditor. Judy Randall is a woman who does audits on behalf of the state legislature. And she audited Feeding Our Future after the fact. And she got, and you or I were there. We were at the hearing where she testified to the legislature. And she was asked this problem, why did this happen? And she talked about how in state government, you use the word empathy, but there's this culture of wanting to help. So the bias is always toward sending the cash out first, asking the questions later if they ever get to them, because they think they're helping. There's not a skepticism. There's not a cynicism that you need. Well, maybe we should check to make sure they're eligible first, or maybe we should check to make sure this is a legitimate operation. They just assume everyone's good faith. And I talk about this frequently in the scandal tracker and the subject in bigger terms. Government is on the honor system. We assume in state law and the operation of government programs that everybody's on the up and up, and only address it in the exceptions. So there really isn't a way, just like the wildfires in California, when it gets to be 5,000 acres, there's nothing you can do about it. When you have industrial scale fraud going on, there really aren't mechanisms currently in state government to combat something that big. They can go after one or two at a time, but when they're hundreds at a time coming at them, stealing hundreds of millions, they just throw up their hands and,
Well, it's culture and it's attitude though too, and I think it's just kind of who's the type of person that maybe takes that job in the first place as a bureaucrat in a department that hands out money or helps kids or something. But man, you just there's got to be somewhere in that culture, in that leadership, in that bureaucracy that has that. And I'll use a personal example between you and me, because we've worked together in the past. And this is a weird story, but you were the energy czar basically for Governor Tim Pawlenty in the Pawlenty administration, and you and I were working together at the Department of Commerce, and there was a program called LIHEAP, or Low Income Heating Assistance Program, and the feds in one year when we were there together poured a whole bunch of new money into this program. It was buckets of new money, way more than we've ever handed out. These are grants to people, to organizations, to help them weatherize their house, to help them with their heating assistance bills. So imagine a 90% increase in funding, or 100% more than that even. I think it was like, I can't remember the order of how much more money, but I just remember you were running that program, and your whole message as a leader in that capacity was your fear that someone's going to use that money to build a hot tub. I think that was the example you used. You're like, somewhere this money's going to, grant's going to go down, and someone's going to build a hot tub in their backyard, and we cannot let that happen. And I think everybody that worked in that division, that was in charge of handing out that money, understood that. I heard you say that. And so there's a leadership that you can provide if you have that mindset to say, hey, let's hand out the money because the feds gave it to us and there are people in need. But man, oh man, let's not let anybody build a hot tub with it. Do you remember that? I mean,
Oh no, I totally remember
remembering
that.
that
And
wrong? I mean,
I have to say though, it happened. It wasn't a hot tub, it was a Cadillac. So there
okay.
was a nonprofit that was operating in the metro area that was handing out grants under this program. And it turns out the executives at the nonprofit were skimming money from it to luxury vacation. It's the same old story. Luxury vacations, they leased a Cadillac SUV. They went to jail. The guy and his son at this nonprofit went to jail. They were prosecuted. The nonprofit went out of business. The corporation was dissolved. It no longer exists. Other nonprofits took over helping. So the people who were legitimately getting help paying their electric bills or their gas bills continued to receive assistance. But this corporation was put out of business. Its ownership was sent to prison because they were doing exactly what you said. They saw an opportunity, more government money flooding in faster than the bureaucrats could keep track of it. And they got caught and went to jail. And that's what's happening here. But again, that was a few $100,000 went out the door that never got recovered. This is a few $100 million went out the door. You know, you can have that leadership, can't stop it from happening 100%, but without that leadership, Katie barred the door.
Right, right. What about walls? And we talk about some of the people in the chat are asking about walls again. And I just, when the legislative auditor had her words and her opinions about the Department of Education's lack of controls or accountability, Walls's defense was sort of like, well, none of my people stole any money. I mean, I think as far as he could get to is like, well, no, because they asked him, well, did you fire anybody? Did anybody get fired for this? Well, they didn't do anything wrong. They didn't steal any money. So there's this, it's like he can't even comprehend that maybe a competence, would be a reason to
Right.
fire somebody. Like, under your watch, you didn't steal. We're not throwing you in jail, but you're fired because you ran a program and it completely got fleeced by fraudsters under your control. That's incompetence. And governor, it didn't seem to enter his mind that that's why he would fire anybody, because these unbelievably well-intentioned state employees in the
Right.
union, by
They
the
had
way.
all the best intentions. They felt for the poor children who weren't being fed, et cetera, et cetera. I always talk about the three feasances: malfeasance, nonfeasance, and misfeasance. So the governor says there was no and I think he used the word. I think he used the word malfeasance.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody has shown evidence of malfeasance on the part of state government employees. How about nonfeasance? They admitted in court that they didn't go and visit a single one of these alleged food distribution sites. And you and I have visited a bunch of them. It's obvious
Yeah.
just pulling up in the
Yeah.
parking lot or driving by on the street. They didn't feed 3,000 kids a day
No.
out of this storefront or out of this office building. It's just, but they never got in the car. Oh, we're scared of COVID. Never got in the car, drove over there. So again, nonfeasance, misfeasance, not grounds for firing, not grounds for discipline. That in the governor's mind, the only way you can be fired, and maybe this is theoretical, I don't know if he's ever fired anybody in his 6 years of government. We worked for a different governor, and people who didn't perform weren't there the next day.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, well, you go back to the original start of this, I think, would be childcare fraud in the Department of HHS under his watch, or maybe that was Mark Dayton's watch,
No, no,
to
no.
be
This is under
fair.
his watch. So
Was
I
it
have my
okay?
scandal tracker. I've been keeping
Okay.
track of all the fraud scandals perpetrated during Tim Walz's term as governor, going back to 2019. And one of the very first ones was everybody remembers the $100 million that went out the door from the child care scandal. And so many of these food people, that's where they got their start. Aimee Bock came from the child care world. A
Yep.
bunch of the people indicted, they got into the food programs through daycares they ran. So this stuff all ties together. And it's 6 years of Governor Walz saying, we care about fill in the blank, the poor, the children, and we're going to err on the side of getting the money out the door every time. And unless one of our people is indicted in federal court, we can't do any. We can't. Throws up his hands. Can't do anything about
Well,
it.
I think the reason I brought up the child care was that there was an inspector general internal at HHS. I can't remember her name, but she wasn't
Carolyn
fired.
Ham.
Ham, yeah. So
Carolyn. She wasn't fired. She was
wasn't fired.
promoted.
She was like reassigned, given a different job, taken out of the investigative unit, but I mean, obviously incompetent and wasn't keeping up. And this is going on. There were some Senate oversight hearings at the time. It was obvious that there was a problem. He wouldn't fire her. Nobody ever gets fired in the administration. Maybe that's a good segue to going forward. Maybe we can clean up a few feeding our future things before we go. Just before we move on to like solutions, and what the future looks like. Someone asked in the chat about Jamal Osman, Minneapolis City Council member, whose wife had one of these locations. I think you sent me to visit them and take some photos at one point in our investigations, and it's just a nondescript three-story office building that purportedly fed a bunch of children. Again, like no, they didn't, not here. What's the status of her and him?
Yeah. So he started one of the nonprofits who was later accused of stealing tens of millions of dollars. He has never been accused of any wrongdoing. His wife has never been accused of any wrongdoing. None of them have been charged with anything. But again, it's interesting that all this stuff has come out about his involvement with some people who were later indicted in the case, including the mayor's aide who was going to go on trial next month, and his wife taking hundreds of $1,000s out of the program with no evidence she ever fed any children. Although they haven't been charged with any crimes, they've never explained themselves. Every time there's a story that comes up where one of their names comes out. In fact, the attorney general shut down her nonprofit. The attorney general went to court and had a court order her nonprofit be dissolved. She never filed any tax returns. She never registered with the attorney general. She was accused of all kinds of malfeasance and nonfeasance in civil court, but never charged in criminal court. They have never issued a statement explaining themselves. You and I work for a governor, and I was a public official. Something happened under our watch. We had to be accountable to it, either to the legislature. We had to be accountable to it to the media. But again, Jamal Osman's a great example where no accountability. He never answers questions. None of his city council colleagues ever ask him about it. And it's just the story was yesterday's news. But talking about solutions going forward, Bill Walsh, you have a really good idea that I think would be very helpful, because I've documented in the scandal tracker some $552 million of fraud documented to have occurred under Governor Walz, half of it being the Feeding Our Future stuff. But we already have a separately elected state official called the state auditor, who oddly enough has no power to audit the state. So what is your solution?
Well, right. Conveniently, we have like you said, a constitutional officer called state auditor. They audit city budgets, some city budgets, not even nearly all. Their power has been diminished by the legislature over the years. So they don't even audit all cities. They audit some counties. They audit some school districts. And then they compile audits of all the cities. If you're a city, you do your audit with your local CPA firm, you have to send it into the state auditor. And then there's some analysis done of city spending, the local government spending. It's kind of a weak office, a do nothing office. Doesn't get much publicity, but it's called state auditor, and we elect them statewide. So my idea of going forward is let's empower that office and forget about who's in it now. And Julie Blaha, you can say what you want about her, whether she'd be great at this or not. That doesn't really matter. The office of state auditor could be empowered by the legislature, simply by changing the law and giving that office some weight to do these kind of investigations. I would say you could probably close up the legislative office, the Office of Legislative Auditor, and they have a big staff and a big budget. You could probably transfer that to the state auditor, and those people would probably go right there. They're good at this. And then give that office a portfolio of investigating fraud, going after fraud all over state government, anywhere in the state. Give them, because they're a statewide office, give them that jurisdiction and give them the power to do it. Give them subpoena power, give them a budget, give them investigators, and let them do this. Now imagine this. Imagine the next statewide election, and you've got a governor up and an attorney general.
Next year.
Right, for 2026. Attorney general gets a lot of attention, a governor gets a lot of attention. Nobody pays attention to the state auditors. But imagine a campaign for state auditor where the two candidates stand up and say, here's how I'm going to root out fraud. I will be better at rooting out fraud than my opponent. Here's my history of rooting out fraud, finding fraud, investigating fraud, being tough on fraud. That's what I bring to bear to this office. Hey, voters, elect me, and I will find fraud, root it out, expose it, and save you money. What a great statewide conversation we could have during the election about who best to do this. That would be a great thing for the state. Hey, pick a Democrat, pick a Republican, but pick the best person to root out fraud. They'd be untethered to the governor, because they might run in the same party, but they don't work for the governor. They're a separate office. They don't work for the legislature. They're not connected to anybody. Even the legislative auditor is great, but there's limits to that because the legislative auditor answers to the legislature and to a legislative audit commission who basically tells them what to work on. I mean, they say, here are the topics we want you to cover this year. That kind of comes from the legislature. It's not a bad system, but it's not independent. So my big pitch is empower the state auditor. But there are other ideas.
There are other ideas floating around. So the governor has put forward he had a press conference about this the other day, and he's put forward an idea, and to me it's just rearranging some deck chairs. He's moving some people from one agency to another. He wants to go hire a few dozen more bureaucrats who are going to be members of the public employee labor unions who are going to go after fraud, but they're all going to report to him. And he's demonstrated over 6 years he's completely blasé about the whole topic of fraud, and so he has not policed his own ranks in terms of having commissioners and assistant commissioners who are tough on fraud. So why would we think anything would change if he hires a few dozen more bureaucrats and assigns them to this? We don't have too few employees in state government. We should reassign some people who are already on the payroll to go after this, or the people who are supposed to be running this program say, hey, you got to start visiting some of these places. You got to start checking. I can't believe how many people turn out to be executives of these nonprofits who have felony convictions. There was a guy the other day indicted for a $7 million Medicaid fraud, stealing from that personal care attendant business. He's a convicted murderer. We have convicted murderers operating these nonprofits, and nobody seems to be checking them ahead of time. But this idea of hiring more bureaucrats, there's a legislator whose name is escaping me at the moment, has an idea to create a statewide office of inspector general. Again, still going to be no, I think it's a Democrat. It's still going to be appointed by the governor, still going to be beholden to the governor. So it's just creating at a higher level of the org chart the same problem. And their idea is every agency should have an inspector general, because they don't all have inspector generals. So we should have more bureaucrats. But again, they're all reporting back to the same guy who's proven year after year after year he doesn't care about this. So one of the best ideas, and I think this will be a segue to our last segment later on, there's an idea to create at the State House of Representatives a standing committee to go and do nothing but investigate fraud. And that hasn't happened. There hasn't been, since this fraud broke, the Feeding Our Future fraud, a hearing about this since the Democrats took over. That this fraud is hundreds of millions of dollars, but there's been no oversight from the legislature. There have been no committee hearings about it. There have been no bills heard. Everybody's thinking, oh, well, we don't want to interfere with the feds on their trials, but you are separately elected. You have an election certificate, and the Republicans, should they ever gain control of the state house, want to create a dedicated committee to do nothing but investigate fraud in state government programs, which I think is a good idea.
I do too, and I think once they create that committee, whistleblowers will have a place to go, a place to call. You might have some staff appointed there that could do some work and doing investigating. I think that's a fantastic idea. A lot of people in the chat are asking about Attorney General. I mean, the Attorney General by duty is supposed to be regulating, monitoring nonprofits.
Mhm.
Where's he been specifically? And we did have some good news from him on a recent addition to our fraud tracker, our scandal tracker, right?
Yeah, well, again, it's been very odd that Keith Ellison, our current Attorney General, he's been the Attorney General through this whole scandal, and he has in his department, in his office, something called a Medicaid Fraud Investigative Unit, and they do good work. They, on a fairly regular basis, bring cases against people who are stealing from federal programs. This is the state Attorney General indicting people from stealing from the federal Medicaid program. And that's my scandal tracker. That's most of the items by number, not by dollar amount, but by number. He's been very reluctant to get involved in the Feeding Our Future. Now, he's filed some civil suits, but he could file suits against every nonprofit named in these indictments. He could go in state court trying to claw back money for the state treasury. He could go after civil actions and sue. But to my knowledge, he has sued exactly one person who hasn't been indicted in the Feeding Our Future scandal and clawed back a grand total of $1,000 from them. So why isn't he more aggressive about this? I don't know. It's interesting. We talked about Jacob Fry. We talked about some of these other city politicians in Minneapolis. They all took campaign donations from these fraudsters. Keith Ellison took campaign donations from these fraudsters. The governor took campaign donations from these fraudsters. The mayor, city council members, members of Congress, Ilhan Omar, state senators, state reps, they all know who these people are, all met with them, had fundraisers at their locations, took checks from them.
Well,
It's
this
good
this
that the
gets to
feds.
this gets to a difficult question that's in the chat quite a bit, and it's difficult to talk about or difficult to answer. But there's a one particular policy or one particular population, one particular constituency involved in a lot of these, if not almost all of them. And it's the Somali community. So, is that what's preventing these politicians from doing more? Is it a political constituency that provides them votes and money? Is it I mean, on the other hand, is there a built-in victim here because we've got recent immigrants, and so they become the dupes, I suppose, in these situations where they're used to apply for the grant and we'll get you money, and then the fraud takes over, whereas somebody maybe that's born and raised in Minnesota would go, oh, we can't do that. That doesn't sound right. I mean, what do you
Well,
say? I mean, it's a
yeah,
difficult thing to answer. And you've got a population of Somalis in the state of 100,000 or so, and there's a very small number of them that are committing a
right,
lot of fraud in Minnesota. You have
right.
to admit that. You have to say that.
So here, there's a kind of two angles you can come at. So we have documented how the Department of Education pulled its punches and refused to investigate and took no action to cut off the money supply because they were afraid of the racist accusation. So
Yep.
that's documented that they didn't do their due diligence. They committed nonfeasance because they were being accused of racism, accused of discriminating against this one particular ethnic population. We've established that as a fact. On the other hand of the coin, you mentioned there, and we don't have a great number on this, but there's something on the order of 100,000 people of Somali ethnicity living in Minnesota. The number of fraudsters probably doesn't number more than 500. So if you round off, the number of fraudsters is very, very tiny. We know who they are. They're the same people who did this, the PCA fraud. They're the same people who did the childcare fraud. There's about 500 of them. It's a vanishingly small percent of the population. And you mentioned whistleblowers. You and I have both met in person with whistleblowers in this case who are from the Somali community.
Mm-hmm.
The people who are most outraged by the fraud are the people inside the Somali community because they
Right.
see it every day. They see the people driving brand new Mercedes
Getting rich.
SUVs. They see the people buying brand new homes who are getting rich off of fraud, and they're outraged by it. And their outrage is manifested by they're calling you, they're calling me, they call the FBI. So you can't say there's a Somali problem. The problem is there are fraudsters, and the state government won't go after them because they're afraid of, losing their votes, losing their campaign donations. And that just
Or
enrages the people within the Somali community more.
yeah,
It's a
and it
weird
gets back to
conundrum.
that suicidal empathy thing, where empathy freezes us from doing the right thing, which would help
But,
everybody in
a
the
good
end.
analogy of it is this last election where Donald Trump did amazingly well with people of Hispanic origin. So his running on, we're going to do mass deportations and close the borders, everybody said, well, he's going to lose a Hispanic vote. No, he did better than any Republican has ever done with the Hispanic vote, because the people who are most impacted by and the most outraged by the open southern border are people who already live here who are Hispanic.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up this topic. I think I think I've done a good job on the Q&A, and I'm not gonna get everybody's. I get it. There's a ton in here. There is one though. This more specific. Like, well, can folks go to federal court and watch? Is there seats available, Bill?
Oh yeah, and I do it all the time. So there are
Okay, you
three
go. Yeah.
rows of
So
benches. You got to go through security in the lobby,
yeah.
just like you would in any federal building, but they don't take down your name or anything. And you just go up to it's on the 13th floor usually, and then just sitting. You got to turn off your cell phone. You got to behave and all that.
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
anybody from the general public, and I do this frequently, you can go to federal court and observe in person on the scene.
A related question: where do you find the court documents online?
Yeah, so if
Someone's had trouble finding them.
it's difficult to find the documents because you have to have an account, and they charge you 10 cents a page. It's a kind of a hassle. But the schedules are all public. And if
Okay.
you go to the U.S. District Court of Minnesota's website, you can click on the schedule for the Minneapolis court for the next 2 weeks and see the time that starts and the room it's going to happen in. And I'll probably publish the stuff when we get
Yeah,
closer to the event. But
I will say
yeah,
we
I
try
do
to
it
do
all the
that
time.
here. Yeah, we try to publish. We try to link when we get documents. We try to link to them because we think it's a service. If you want to dig deeper, here's a click. You can link off and actually read that source document. So we'll try to do that. All right, we have about 8 minutes left in the hour. And I kind of want to keep to an hour because it's a lunchtime webinar. But the legislature convenes on Monday, and if you want to keep throwing questions in the chat here in the last few minutes, that's fine too. Legislature convenes at noon on Monday. Secretary of State's going to walk up to the podium. He's going to say, the House is now in session, bang the gavel. He's going to appoint a clerk, a temporary clerk from the membership. It'll probably be a Democrat House member. And he's going to instruct the clerk to.
Hey, don't presume anything.
Well, this is what normally would happen. Let's just say it that way. And then that clerk will call the roll by district. And that's kind of where we hand in our election certificates and say we're here representing Dakota County. Here I am with my election certificate. Okay. 133 people are going to do that. I think at this point, it kind of all breaks down. We really don't know what's going to happen. Are the Democrats going to show up for that part? Because the next step is they get sworn in by a justice of the Supreme Court usually. Are they going to come and get sworn in? If they don't come and get sworn in, because the Democrats have announced basically that they're not going to show up. Because by not showing up, they think that doesn't give the House the quorum it needs to conduct business. The business would be electing a Republican speaker. They don't want to do that. So they're talking about not showing up. People who just knocked on doors for months to get this job, raised money, gave their life to a campaign, won, and now are talking about not showing up on the first day of the floor of the House to start their new job or their job that they've had before. It seems
More
outrageous.
non-feasance. So yeah, and so I've talked about this on Twitter. I wrote a couple of posts for the website. I know you did a podcast thing on this. And so they're the Democrats are trying to sabotage the launch of the legislature because they think by doing so, they get a partisan advantage out of it. And all of the Constitution, state statutes, they all presume this good faith. It's all in the honor system. They didn't contemplate a situation where half the legislature, I don't know why you wouldn't show up, because I ran for state rep. It was a hassle.
Right.
Why wouldn't you show up? Well, because you think you get some partisan advantage by it. But I want to just, again, don't want to get deep into the weeds here, but I want to impress upon people the legislature, when Steve Simon stands up and says the House is now in session, the legislature doesn't exist. That we call it the 93rd or the 94th legislature of the state of Minnesota, but there is a space of a few minutes to a couple of hours where there is no legislature. That all of the ritual that goes on in that chamber from that podium is to conjure up a legislature into existence ex nihilo. Hate to use Latin, but it doesn't exist. And then people turn in their certificates, a roll is called, then the magic words are spoken, we have a quorum. If we never get to that point, I've pointed out, you don't get another bite at the apple. You're done for the year. You have to call a special session, which has a completely different set of rules to it. So everybody who says confidently what will happen or won't happen if Democrats don't show up, or they show up and they leave before a certain point, they're just making stuff up. This has never happened before.
No, and we are heading. The constitutional crisis is the word I would use to describe it. We're headed for a constitutional crisis because there's like you said, if Democrats not showing up, 66 members of the House, so not one of them is going to peel off. Every one of them is going to do what their leader tells them to do, what Tim Walz tells them to do, what Ken Martin tells them to do from the Democrat Party. This is the team play today. We're not going to show up with our election certificates and get sworn in. That's the first thing. Not one of them is going to have any integrity and say, well, you can play your political games, but I got elected to the House. I got to represent the people of the county that I come from. I'm going to show up and I'm going to vote. I'm going to vigorously fight my opponents philosophically on the floor of the House. That's what I was called to do, but I'm going to show up. So that's the first thing. And then Steve Simon's going to say there's no quorum, and then he's going to walk out. I mean, what accounts for how does the House come back to order? How does the House come in? You can't just come in the next day and say, well, that was a practice run. We'll come back tomorrow.
So
the last thing done at the House every day is that they set the time for adjournment. They say when the House do adjourn, we'll come back at tomorrow at noon. That's done every day because then we know when to come back. I'm not sure how the House comes back.
Democrats haven't thought this through. That seems, from my interaction with them on Twitter, they seem to have not thought through the next 2 or 3 steps. And so they have this idea that they're going to wait until these special elections happen, and they think they're going to win these special elections and come back in a better position, maybe a 67-67 tie, and get a better cut of the deal. There's nothing to come back to. They blew it. The legislature doesn't exist. So they have to have a special election. And I don't know you can conjure a legislature into an existence in a special session.
Well, the other problem you have is that the Senate will adjourn. The Senate will come into they will have a quorum. They'll be working across the hall in the Capitol. So you will have half the legislature working and the other half not. But there's a limit to what the Senate can do if the House is not in session, because under the rules, they can't stay in session for 3 days if the other body's not also in session. So they'll have to
thought
adjourn.
This thing through. And one of the speculations of what will happen if Steve Simon walks from the podium and then they keep going in some rump parliament out of Oliver Cromwell days. They said, well, we have, and you've seen this, the quorum call where we dispatch the sergeant at arms to bring in the absent members. And well, they can't do that because we don't have a sergeant at arms.
We don't have a sergeant
because
at arms.
We don't have a legislature. And they say, well, we're going to be continuing. The Democrats say, well, we're not going to be on the floor, but we're going to be working with our staff and conferring with other staff. There will be no staff. The people who work for the legislature will no longer work for the legislature because the legislature will not exist. So their whole idea of, well, we're going to be working in our districts and working with staff and getting ready for when we really start this thing, they don't know that. And it's just amazing how confidently they speak of exactly how this thing will play out when they haven't thought through steps 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, you're right. There is no precedent for what they're talking about doing, where 66 people don't, in Minnesota at least. They've talked about other states doing it. It's been a disaster wherever it's been done in other states too. I mean, it's just,
well, and it's the timing of it. Other states have done these stunts where, and it's happened with both parties. One of the parties will walk out in protest or walk out to delay a bill being passed or whatever their tactical objective is. But it's always been months downrange. No one has ever sabotaged day one while we're conjuring this legislature into existence. That has never happened before. There simply is no precedent for how do you recover. So it's like a rocket. My analogy is the rocket launch. If you're in orbit or you're trying to do reentry and something goes wrong, you're in a much better position to fix things than those first few critical seconds while you're trying to get off the ground.
Yeah, and all of this goes back to just a final comment because we're out of time, but all of it goes back to the fact that we don't really have a 67-67 tie at the moment because the Democrats in Roseville couldn't find a candidate to run who actually lived in the district, and their candidate was bounced off of the ticket or well not allowed to present his election certificate, frankly, to the legislature next week because he cheated. They cheated essentially. They tried to skirt the rules, and he wasn't quite in the district. And the court found that. And that's why we are where we are, where we have Democrats planning to not show up at the session. That was our little aside for 10 minutes at the end of our webinar on feeding our future. But thanks for listening. We'll send this to everybody as soon as we get it finished. And all the people that signed up can get a copy of this, and we'll have it posted as well. Continue going to AmericanExperiment.org for more information on future events. I'm guessing we'll do another Feeding Our Future update in a month or so, or maybe a month and a half after these trials get going, because there's a lot of interest, and we'll keep the updates going. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.